All right, thank you all for coming. I'm State Senator Jason Welch, for those of you who don't know me, and this is State Representative Whit Betts from the 78th District. And we're both pleased and honored to have a special guest tonight who's doing a fiscal accountability tour throughout the state. And that's State Senator John McKinney of the 28th District, which includes Fairfield, Weston, Easton, Westport, and Newtown. Senator McKinney is also the minority leader in the Senate, so he's the leader of the caucus that I sit in, the Senate Republican Caucus. It's been an honor and a pleasure to serve with him for over 2 years now. He has a wonderful style of leadership that's very inclusive, and he lets ideas sell themselves when supported with facts. So I guess a little unknown fact is Senator McKinney and I are both lawyers. I hold that against us.
Yeah, I don't practice anymore, he does.
And we both cut our teeth along with Senator Dick Blumenthal at the same firm, although one of us did that decades before the other two, and I'll let you figure out who that one is. So, what we're going to do is we have a brief presentation that we'd like to walk everybody through, and we'd ask that you hold any questions you have until after the presentation, and then we'll have a Q&A session. We'll be able to spend some time talking through some of the questions you might have based on. No. All right. So without further ado, Senator McKinney.
Do I need to use that? Or?
I don't know. Can you hear us all back there?
Can you hear us?
The microphone doesn't help much, but yeah, speak up.
Okay.
All
So,
right, thank you.
well, thank you for that, Jason, and good evening, everyone. And let me just, as Jason said, my name is John McKinney, and I'm the minority leader, Republican leader of the state Senate. And I think Bill Hamsey, former state representative Bill Hamsey, is here. For years, Bill and I served in the legislature together, and said, Bill, when are we gonna, get someone like Jason Welch in the state Senate? And we finally did, and Jason's done a great job on behalf of the people of Bristol and the rest of his district. And Whit is a great, doesn't look like it, but he's a great new addition to the legislature as well. The legislative session started in January when a new legislature was sworn in, and one of our first tasks was to hear from the governor and the governor's presentation of his 2-year budget. That's for a budget for what we call our fiscal year 2014 and 2015. That budget year starts July 1st, 2013. It's a budget that the legislature, through the Appropriations Committee and the Finance Committee, are going through right now and poring over. It's a budget with much controversy. What I want to do and what we want to do is go around the state to as many people as possible and tell them about the quite frankly, fiscal crisis we face in the state of Connecticut. What some of the proposals from the governor are, what some of the solutions that we as Republicans have offered. But before we can talk about some of those solutions, we want to hear from you. I've said this is my 15th year in the legislature, that I haven't seen or heard any great ideas come from within the legislature. They usually come from constituents, real people, who talk to their state representative, talk to their state senator, an idea that makes sense, and they bring it up to the Capitol on your behalf, and that's how we get good laws. So we have a very brief presentation, and then we would love to entertain questions you have about the presentation, about the state budget, ideas that you have. I think you'll learn pretty quickly that we think our state spends too much and taxes too much, and we'd love to hear ideas you have on that. And when we finish with your questions on the budget, if there's other questions, we can certainly take those on as well. So if we take a look at the first slide, this is an overall view of 3 things. The blue line is state population growth. We picked a starting date of 1987. There's no historical significance to that. We talked about doing a slide starting around 1991, which was the institution of the income tax, but you can see that the facts are pretty much the same. Again, state population over a quarter of a century has grown slightly, as shown by the blue line. The green line shows the rate of inflation over that same period of time, and that rate of inflation has been just slightly over 98%. The red line shows state spending. And obviously, as you can see, despite a relatively stable population, despite an inflation of about 98%, state spending has increased 318% over that time period. And as you can tell, right around the time the income tax came in, that's right around the time where state spending started to skyrocket. We take a look at the next slide. This shows you where our money comes from in very generic categories. The income tax is the largest income source to state government. 39% of all our revenue comes from the income tax. The sales tax is the second largest at 19%. You can note that the third largest chunk of revenue comes from the federal government, which is our money that we pay down to Washington. And we could expect that that percentage may shrink as we go forward. Quite frankly, that may not be a bad thing, because the federal government spends too much money, in my opinion, as well. If we take a look at the next slide, this shows you the reverse, where our money goes. And again, if you look at the lower left-hand side, you see the largest source of our state spending. That's in the broad category of social service programs. The second largest is over in the right, education, 21%, just under the 22% of social services. That education spending includes money in the education cost-sharing formula, ECS, that goes to towns and cities. It also includes our spending on our higher education system, our state universities in Yukon. The other thing I would point out to you is up in the top left, you see repayment of debt, 11%. That means that 11 cents of every dollar we spend of your money goes to pay interest on our borrowing, on our debt. Connecticut currently has the unfortunate distinction of having the highest per capita debt of all 50 states in the country. 11 cents of every dollar is a high number to be spending on interest on your debt. If we take a look at the next slide, this just shows you some of the trajectory of spending that's occurred. As many of you may know, when Governor Malloy took over, this state was facing a $3.5 billion budget deficit. Despite that $3.5 billion budget deficit, spending still increased. So the 2011, FY 2011 shows spending at $19.169 billion. 2013, a year with a $3.5 billion deficit, shows spending increased at $20.279 billion. There was an increase in revenue, which was consistent with the tax increase that was imposed by Governor Malloy. And then the bottom line is bonding. That's our borrowing. Again, with the highest per capita debt in the country, with an operating deficit, bonding still increased from $2 billion to $2.26 billion. Governor Malloy and his budget director have said to the Finance Committee recently that they expect that bonding number to go up as much as somewhere between 20 to 30%. In other words, they're going to borrow 20 to 30% more under his budget than they did last year. If we take a look at the next slide, this shows where we currently are in 2013. That's the fiscal year we currently are in. That year ends on June 30th. And the next 2 years we're going to be in. And again, after seeing the largest tax increase in our history, which was actually $3.8 billion over 2 years, $1.8 in one of the years. We'll have to get that slide fixed. We still are looking at a $2.5 billion budget deficit for 2014 and 2015. So the governor's given us a budget for the next 2 years, which has to deal with a $2.5 billion budget deficit. And you can see the red numbers there. In 2014, that deficit is 1.19 billion, and in 2015, it's 1.3 billion. You take a look at the next page. This shows you in just bottom line numbers what Governor Malloy has proposed to spend over the next 2 years. And if you look at adding up 2014 and 2015, you get $1.844 billion more spending in the next 2 years that we had in the previous year, which amounts to a 9.64% spending increase